It was a crisp afternoon in the heart of New York City. The kind of day when the skyline glimmered with the promise of something beyond the usual hustle and bustle. As Mike stepped out of his hotel, the noise of the city seemed distant, drowned out by the weight of the thoughts swirling in his mind. Another photo shoot was coming up. Another round of interviews to promote his latest film. And he couldn't help but feel the familiar tug of exhaustion in his chest. The relentless pace of his career had begun to feel like a machine moving forward. Unstoppable. But always demanding more from him. And yet, it was during this brief moment of stillness, as he walked out onto the sidewalk, that everything would change. He barely noticed her at first, a small, fragile figure huddled against the cold stone of the building, her bald head stark against the backdrop of the city. It wasn't the usual sight of beggars or homeless people that caught his attention. No, this girl was different. She was clutching the leg of a passerby, her eyes wide with fear, as if the world around her was a jungle, and she was a vulnerable animal caught in its grasp. The store owner standing nearby scowled as he watched her cling to the stranger's leg, clearly irritated. "She's just a troublemaker," he muttered, his voice thick with disdain. "Hasn't stolen anything. But she sure knows how to beg." The words stung. And Mike, despite his fame and wealth, felt a stirring of anger. Something about the girl's vulnerability felt different to him. A call for help that went beyond just the obvious. The man's words hung in the air. But Mike couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something more than just a simple case of a homeless girl asking for spare change. He turned to look at her again. Her eyes locked with his. And in that instant, he felt a strange pull. It was as if the world had slowed for a moment. And he could see the fear, the isolation, and the pain that radiated from her small, fragile form. Mike took a step forward, silently walking past the irritated store owner, and knelt down to meet the girl's gaze. Her thin lips parted as if she wanted to say something but couldn't quite find the words. "Are you okay?" Mike asked, his voice softer than he'd intended. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills, handing them to her with a small, uncertain smile. She hesitated, then looked at the money, then at him. Her eyes held a mixture of gratitude and confusion, as if she didn't know how to process the kindness. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And for a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. Mike felt a pang in his chest. Something told him that this was more than just a random encounter. There was a story behind those eyes, a story he couldn't ignore. "Are you hungry?" he asked, gently. She nodded. But before she could say anything else, the store owner barked again, clearly irritated by the attention the girl was getting. "She'll just spend it on more junk," he grumbled. But Mike, feeling something shift within him, ignored the man and turned his attention back to the girl. "Where do you live?" he asked quietly. The girl's gaze dropped to the pavement. And for a moment, Mike wasn't sure if she'd even answer. I don't have a place," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I'm just trying to get some money for medicine. I need to get better." "Medicine?" Mike repeated, his brow furrowing. He looked at her closely, really looking at her for the first time. Her bald head, the slight tremor in her hands, the tiredness in her eyes, it all began to make sense. She wasn't just a homeless girl begging for food or shelter. She was someone who needed real help. "Why don't we get you somewhere warm? And I can help with that," Mike asked, feeling an unfamiliar sense of urgency. The girl, startled by his offer, took a step back, her eyes wide. I don't want to be a burden," she stammered, shaking her head. "You're not a burden," Mike assured her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Let's get you some help. You don't have to do this alone." The girl seemed to hesitate for a moment, but the sadness in her eyes softened, and she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. It wasn't a perfect solution. There was no guarantee that a warm place or a few bills would solve the deeper issues she faced. But something told Mike that he had to act now. This wasn't a moment he could walk away from. As they walked together, the city continued its bustling march. The noise, the crowds, the endless flow of people, it all faded into the background. Mike didn't know it yet. But this moment, this simple encounter with a homeless girl on the streets of New York, would change the course of his life. He called his assistant on his phone, instructing her to arrange a meeting with an organization that supported homeless children. But deep down, Mike knew that what this girl needed wasn't just a place to stay or money for medicine. She needed love, empathy, and someone to care enough to give her a chance. And somehow, Mike had become that person. As they walked, the girl finally spoke again, her voice trembling as she asked, "Do you think I'll ever get better?" Mike stopped walking for a moment, looking at her with a mixture of determination and compassion. "I believe you will," he said softly, "and I'm going to help you get there." For the first time in a long while, Mike felt a sense of purpose beyond the bright lights of the Hollywood red carpet. It was the beginning of something important, a journey of compassion, of hope, and of profound connection. And as they continued walking, side by side, Mike couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead for this little girl who had crossed his path in such an unexpected way. But whatever it was, Mike knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't turn his back on her. Not now. Not ever. As Mike and Emma walked through the busy streets of New York, the city around them seemed to blur. It was as though the world had dimmed its lights just for them. The hum of the traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, the clatter of subway trains, they all faded into the background, leaving only the soft sound of their footsteps. Mike couldn't explain it, but the deeper he got into this conversation with Emma, the more he felt that he was moving towards something important, something that had the power to change both of their lives. Despite her initial hesitation, Emma had agreed to let him help. She followed him quietly, her bare feet barely making a sound on the concrete. Mike's mind raced, trying to piece together what he had learned so far. She had a medical condition, something related to her baldness, and she had been on the streets begging for money to cover her treatment. But what kind of illness would cause such fear in a young girl? And why had she ended up alone on the streets of New York? They made their way to a quiet park, tucked away from the frenzy of Times Square, where Mike decided they could talk more privately. He asked her to sit on one of the benches, hoping it would give her a chance to relax a bit. Mike didn't want to rush things. He could tell she was holding back, guarded, unwilling to open up too quickly. But he knew, somewhere deep down, that if he could gain her trust, he would learn the truth about her situation. "Emma," Mike began gently, sitting down next to her, "you don't have to tell me everything, but I want to understand. You said you needed money for medicine. What's going on with you?" Emma's hands twisted in her lap, her eyes fixed on the ground. "I've been sick for a while," she murmured. "I don't know exactly what it is, but it's bad. I'm not sure how much longer I can keep going like this." Mike could hear the weight in her voice, the exhaustion, the desperation that so many people in her situation must have felt. But this was more than just physical pain. There was something else. A deeper kind of loneliness. A sense of abandonment that was almost palpable in the way Emma spoke. "Have you been to the hospital?" Mike asked, trying to gauge how serious her condition might be. "I can't afford it," Emma replied, her voice quivering. "The orphanage, they don't have enough money for everyone, let alone for me. I just need to survive until I can get the treatment. But I don't know how much longer I can wait." Mike felt his heart ache for her. He couldn't imagine what it must feel like to be a child in that kind of situation. Sick and alone, with no one to turn to for help. The weight of her words hit him harder than any of the press conferences or movie premieres he had attended in his life. Here, in front of him, was a young girl who had been cast aside by society, left to fight for survival on the streets. His mind raced. How had she ended up like this? What had happened to her family? The questions swirled in his head. But he didn't press her for answers just yet. He could tell Emma wasn't ready to share everything. "You shouldn't have to be out here alone," Mike said softly, trying to comfort her. "I'm going to help you, Emma. I'll make sure you get the treatment you need. You don't have to worry about anything anymore." Her eyes flicked up to meet his, a mix of disbelief and hope shining through. "You mean it?" "I promise," Mike said, his voice steady. "I'll take care of it. I'll make sure you get the best care possible." For a moment, Emma just stared at him, as if unsure whether to believe him or not. But something shifted in her gaze. A flicker of trust, however small. Slowly, she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. Mike knew that this was only the beginning. There was so much more to uncover. So many pieces of her story yet to be told. But right then, in that moment, he was focused on one thing: Emma's health, her well-being, and the promise he had made to her. He couldn't take back his words. And more importantly, he didn't want to. This wasn't just about a girl on the streets needing help, it was about something much deeper. A chance for redemption, for connection, for healing. Not just for Emma, but for himself too. As they sat in the park, the sun beginning to set over the city skyline, Mike made a silent vow to himself. No matter what it took, he would do everything in his power to help this girl. He couldn't change the past, but he could change her future. And that was where it all began. The promise of a new chapter. For both of them. Mike spent the next few hours pacing around his apartment, his mind still reeling from the encounter with Emma. He couldn't shake the image of her, small, fragile, and alone, sitting on that park bench, telling him about her illness and the unbearable life she had been forced to live. His heart ached for her. And the more he thought about her, the more he realized how much he had to do. He sat down at his desk, his fingers tapping nervously against the wood. It wasn't often that Mike Depp felt completely out of his depth. Most of the time, he was in control of his career, of the public image he had crafted so carefully over the years. But this was different. Helping Emma wasn't something he could just fix with a few phone calls or a monetary donation. It required time, commitment, and a level of emotional investment that he wasn't sure he was prepared for. Yet, as much as he tried to push away the sense of responsibility, it clung to him. This wasn't just about a young girl with a medical condition, it was about a human being. Someone who deserved a chance at life. He couldn't just walk away from that. He thought back to the conversation he'd had with Emma. The desperation in her voice. The way her eyes had lit up with just a small spark of hope when he promised to help. It wasn't just the promise of medical care that had touched her, it was the simple act of someone caring enough to make that promise. In that moment, Mike had realized that Emma wasn't asking for charity, she was asking for humanity. And if there was one thing Mike had learned over the years, it was that the only way to truly make a difference in someone's life was to show up for them, not just with your money, but with your time. Your heart. Your attention. Mike was no stranger to sacrifice. He had given up time with family, with friends, even his own peace of mind for his career. But this felt different. He didn't need a movie set or a public relations campaign to fix this. What he needed was to be there for Emma in the most profound way possible, to show her that, no matter how far she'd fallen, she could still find someone who would help her climb back up. With a deep sigh, Mike picked up the phone and dialed the number of his assistant, Ruth. She picked up on the first ring, her voice calm and efficient as always. "Ruth, I need you to cancel everything for the next few days. I don't care what it is, no meetings, no calls, no shoots. I'm staying here in New York. There's something I need to take care of." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Of course, Mike. I'll reschedule everything for you. Thanks, Ruth," Mike said, his voice firm. "And I need you to arrange for the best medical care we can get for a young girl named Emma. She's in need of treatment. And I want it to be top priority. If you can help me with that, I'd appreciate it." "Understood," Ruth replied, her voice filled with a professionalism that Mike admired. "I'll get to work on it immediately." As Mike hung up the phone, a weight seemed to lift off his shoulders. He wasn't just reacting now, he was taking control, doing what needed to be done. And that felt like the first step toward something meaningful. Later that evening, Mike visited the orphanage that Emma had told him about. He hadn't mentioned to her that he was coming, but he felt he needed to see for himself the place where Emma had spent so much of her life. When he arrived, he was greeted by a warm, elderly woman with kind eyes who introduced herself as Miss Abigail, the caregiver at the orphanage. She seemed surprised but pleased to see him, clearly not expecting someone of his stature to be interested in the humble building she had dedicated herself to running. "I understand you're here about Emma?" Miss Abigail asked, her voice soft but welcoming. Mike nodded, his gaze flicking around the orphanage. It was small, the walls a bit worn, but there was a certain warmth in the air. Children's laughter echoed through the halls, but there was an underlying sense of struggle, barely enough resources to go around. Barely enough love to heal the deep wounds many of these children had carried with them. "Emma," Mike began. "She's an incredible girl. But I'm concerned about her health. I know she hasn't received the care she needs, and I want to change that." Miss Abigail looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, as if she hadn't quite expected anyone to come to their aid. "I appreciate your kindness, Mr. Depp. Emma is special, but we've had little luck getting her the care she needs. We simply don't have the funds, and the city isn't always willing to help." Mike's jaw clenched with frustration. It wasn't right, he thought. No child, no person, should have to suffer because of financial barriers. Emma didn't deserve to be a statistic. She deserved to live, to thrive. "I'll do whatever it takes," Mike said quietly, his resolve firm. "I'm setting up a fund for her treatment and the orphanage. This place deserves better. Emma deserves better." Miss Abigail's eyes misted over with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't know how much this means." Mike nodded, feeling a deep sense of purpose fill him. This was the beginning of something much bigger than he had anticipated. And for the first time in a long time, Mike Depp felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The next few days were a blur of medical appointments, logistical planning, and meetings with the best specialists in the city. Ruth had come through for him, pulling every string she could to arrange the best possible treatment for Emma. But despite the whirlwind of activity, Mike found himself with one clear, unwavering thought: Emma was going to get better, and he was going to make sure of it. Mike's commitment to her care wasn't just about paying for her medical bills. It was more than that. It was about giving her a chance to live, to experience life beyond the limitations of her illness. It was about offering her a future. And to do that, he knew he had to be there for her every step of the way. His assistant Ruth had made it clear that he needed to focus on his own career, that there were opportunities he couldn't afford to miss. But as much as Mike wanted to stay on top of his work, he couldn't shake the feeling that his priorities had changed. Being on movie sets, attending events, and fulfilling his obligations had always been at the top of his list. But now, for the first time in years, he was genuinely questioning whether those things mattered as much as they once had. The morning of Emma's surgery arrived, and Mike was there by her side, as he had promised. The hospital was sterile and clinical, a stark contrast to the warmth of the orphanage. But there was a sense of hope in the air. Emma was scheduled for the removal of the primary tumor, and although she was nervous, Mike could see the flicker of determination in her eyes. She had been through so much already. This surgery was just another battle, another hurdle she would overcome. Emma's room was small but comfortable, and Mike sat beside her, trying to ease her nerves as the minutes ticked by. He had spent hours in the waiting rooms of hospitals before, but this felt different. This wasn't just another patient, this was someone he had promised to help. Someone whose life was now intertwined with his own. "Emma, it's going to be okay," Mike said softly, trying to keep his voice steady. She turned her head to look at him, her bald head stark against the white hospital sheets. I'm scared. Mike. What if it doesn't work? What if I don't make it? Mike took her hand in his. The warmth of her small fingers a stark contrast to the coldness of the room. Emma. I promise you. We're going to get through this. You're stronger than you think. And no matter what happens, you're not alone. I'm right here. Okay. She nodded slowly, the tears welling up in her eyes. It wasn't easy for her to trust. Life had shown her too many times that people came and went. But Mike was different. His eyes weren't filled with pity or obligation. They were filled with something real. Something she hadn't seen in a long time, genuine care. I'm scared. Mike, she whispered, her voice trembling. Mike squeezed her hand, his voice steady. I know. But you're not facing this alone. I'm with you. Every step of the way. At that moment, Emma smiled a small, fragile smile that made Mike's heart ache. It was the first time he had seen her so vulnerable, so open. And it reminded him of the importance of this moment, of what was truly at stake. He wasn't just helping her recover from a physical illness. He was giving her the space to heal emotionally, to trust in people again, and to see that she was worthy of love, of care, and of a future. When the time came for the surgery, Mike walked her down the hallway to the operating room. He stayed with her as long as he could, until the nurses assured him that she would be in good hands. As they wheeled her into the surgery room, Mike stood there, feeling a lump form in his throat. He wanted to hold her hand, tell her everything would be okay. But he knew he had to let go for now. He had done all he could now. It was up to the doctors and Emma's own strength. As the doors to the operating room closed, Mike felt a wave of emotions crash over him. He had always been good at compartmentalizing his feelings. But this time, it was different. This was personal. This was more than just an act of charity. This was a commitment. A promise he had made. And he wasn't going to break it. He sat in the waiting room, his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes fixed on the clock. He didn't know how long he would be waiting, but he knew that it didn't matter. He had already made his decision, no matter how long it took. No matter what happened. He would be there for Emma. He would be there for as long as it took to help her heal, to help her rebuild the trust she had lost in the world. Mike wasn't just her benefactor, he was her ally, her protector. And he would do whatever it took to ensure that she had a chance to live. The hours that followed Emma's surgery were some of the longest Mike had ever experienced. He had been through many waiting rooms in his life, on movie sets, during family crises, at business meetings, but nothing had ever made time stretch so unbearably. His mind wandered through a million different thoughts as he sat there, his eyes flicking to the door, willing it to open with good news. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door opened, and Dr. Gordon, the head surgeon, stepped into the room. His face was tired, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Mike jumped to his feet, his heart pounding. Mr. Thompson. Dr. Gordon began, his voice calm yet professional. The surgery was successful. We were able to remove the primary tumor and the affected lymph nodes. It's a big first step. Mike breathed a sigh of relief. But his relief was mixed with anxiety. So, what's next? He asked, his voice tight with concern. Dr. Gordon paused, glancing down at the medical chart in his hands. Well, the next stage is ongoing treatment. Emma will need a course of chemotherapy to make sure all the cancer cells are gone. The radiation might follow depending on how her body responds. But we're hopeful. She's a strong girl. Mike nodded, already processing the information. Chemotherapy. Radiation. It was a long road ahead. And he had no illusions about how difficult it would be. But as he thought of Emma's courage, her strength, he knew she could handle it. And he would be right there by her side. Every step of the way. Thank you, Dr. Gordon, Mike said, his voice steady but full of emotion. I'll make sure she has whatever she needs. Dr. Gordon gave him a kind smile, recognizing the depth of Mike's commitment. "You're doing a good thing, Mr. Thompson. We'll take care of her here. But she'll need all the support she can get from you outside this hospital too." As the doctor left, Mike sat back down in the sterile, cold chair, his hands still trembling from the emotional weight of the conversation. He had always been a man of action, someone who made decisions quickly and without hesitation. But this was different. This wasn't about business deals or making a movie. This was about life itself, about fighting for someone who had no reason to believe she had a future. And Mike had promised that he would make sure Emma had that future. The next few days were a blur of paperwork and plans. Mike made arrangements for Emma's continuing care, ensuring that she had access to the best medical treatments, the finest specialists. He also started looking into long-term options for her, things beyond the hospital room, beyond the treatments. He was committed to making sure Emma not only survived but thrived. He even spoke with Ruth, asking her to research orphanages that could provide the kind of environment Emma needed while she recovered. He wasn't sure exactly what that would look like, but he knew he had the resources to make it happen. He was determined to create a place for Emma where she could heal, not just physically, but emotionally too. But amidst all the plans and logistics, there was something else Mike realized. He wasn't just helping Emma, he was helping himself too. He had always lived his life in the fast lane, chasing after success, fame, and fortune. But now, he saw that those things meant very little when faced with something so raw, so real as life itself. Sitting by Emma's bedside, watching her rest, he realized that this was where his focus needed to be. This little girl, vulnerable, but with such incredible strength, had awakened something in him. A desire to make the world a better place. To use his wealth, his influence, and his resources for something that truly mattered. Emma woke up slowly, her eyelids fluttering as she came to. Her gaze focused on Mike. And for a moment, there was confusion in her eyes. Then, she remembered where she was, and a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Mike," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with warmth. "Did it work?" Mike squeezed her hand gently, a reassuring smile on his face. "It worked. You're going to be okay, Emma. I promise you." She looked up at him, her eyes still tired but grateful. "Thank you," she murmured. I don't know what I would have done without you." Mike's heart ached as he looked at her. This wasn't just a transaction for him. This wasn't just about helping someone because he felt obligated. This was about love. A love for a child who had been through so much. A love that he had never expected to feel for someone outside of his own family. He had seen the world through a lens of success and status for so long. But now, he realized that the true measure of a person's worth wasn't in the number of movies they made, the awards they won, or the money they accumulated. It was in the connections they made, the lives they touched, and the love they gave. Mike looked down at Emma, his heart full, his promise to her stronger than ever. "We're just getting started," he said softly. "We have a long road ahead of us. But together, we'll make it through." Over the following weeks, Mike immersed himself fully in Emma's care and recovery. He learned more about the medical processes than he ever thought he would need to know. Spending hours with doctors, asking questions, understanding the nuances of chemotherapy and radiation treatments. His role had shifted from that of a celebrity trying to stay out of the spotlight, to a man determined to give all of himself to a cause far greater than his own fame. Emma's condition remained fragile, but her strength and resilience impressed everyone who encountered her. It was clear that, despite the severity of her illness, Emma was a fighter, a warrior in the truest sense of the word. Her courage became the heart of Mike's determination to ensure she had everything she needed. One evening, after a particularly tough round of chemotherapy, Mike sat beside Emma's hospital bed, watching as she dozed lightly, her face pale but peaceful. She had grown quiet during her treatment, a little more withdrawn than usual. and Mike could sense that the weight of it all was starting to sink in. Though she had never once complained, Mike knew that the loneliness of being so far from home, the fear of what lay ahead, must have been unbearable. "Hey, Emma," Mike whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're doing great. I want you to know. I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here as long as you need me." Her eyes fluttered open, and she smiled faintly. "I know," she said softly. You've been so kind to me. I don't know how to thank you." Mike chuckled, though his heart was heavy. "You don't need to thank me. I'm doing what anyone would do in my shoes." She shook her head slowly. "No, Mike. What you're doing, it's more than that. You're not just helping me because you feel sorry for me. You've really given me hope." Mike felt a lump form in his throat. Hope. It was a word he hadn't thought much about in his own life. But hearing Emma say it stirred something inside him. In a world so often defined by ambition, success, and fame, hope was the one thing that everyone truly needed, something that could not be bought or fabricated. It was something raw, something vulnerable, and yet so profoundly powerful. As Emma drifted off to sleep again, Mike found himself reflecting on the profound impact she had on him. His life had always been about living in the moment, seizing opportunities, making the next big deal, and worrying about the future only when it arrived. But with Emma, everything had changed. The future wasn't about his career anymore. It wasn't about his latest project, or which movie he was shooting next, or how many people recognized him on the street. It was about ensuring that Emma had the chance to live her life, a full life, one that was not limited by her illness. With that in mind, Mike began taking action. He had always had the means to make an impact. But now, he had the conviction. He contacted specialists, arranged for Emma to receive the best possible care, and set up a fund to cover her medical expenses, both now and in the long term. But his vision extended beyond that. Through his conversations with doctors, he realized that there were many children like Emma, children from poor backgrounds, orphaned or abandoned, who didn't have the luxury of family support, let alone the funds for expensive treatments. It was then that Mike made a vow, not just to Emma, but to all children in need of hope. He would create a foundation that would help children in the most dire circumstances, providing them with medical care, emotional support, and a safe place to heal. He called it Hope's Horizon, a foundation dedicated to ensuring that no child ever had to face a fight like Emma's without someone in their corner. In the weeks that followed, Mike worked tirelessly, gathering resources, building partnerships, and forming alliances with medical professionals, philanthropists, and social workers. The idea was clear: he would create a space where children, like Emma, could receive care that wasn't just focused on the physical healing but also their emotional recovery. Mike had no illusions. It would be hard, and the road ahead would be long. There would be challenges, setbacks, and obstacles. But he was no longer the man who avoided hard work. He was the man who had learned that real success wasn't about accolades or wealth. It was about using whatever platform you had to make a difference. And he had learned that through Emma. Her courage, her quiet strength, had taught him more than any film role or luxury lifestyle ever could. It had shown him the power of human connection, the importance of empathy, and the truth that love, in its simplest form, was the most important thing of all. When Emma finally emerged from her treatments, her recovery had just begun. She was a long way from being fully healthy. But she had already changed Mike's life. He would never be the same person he had been before. And that was something he was grateful for every single day. As Emma's health slowly started to improve, her once pale face began to show signs of life again. Her smile, faint at first, grew brighter with each passing day, and the spark in her eyes that had been dulled by her illness began to return. For Mike, seeing her recovery was the most rewarding experience of his life. Every day, he saw the strength and resilience that she carried with her. and it gave him a renewed sense of purpose. It was the little things that made the biggest difference: Emma sitting up on the bed, laughing at one of Mike's silly jokes, or simply holding his hand as they watched the world go by from her hospital window. Each moment seemed to remind him of the beauty of life, of how fragile it was, and how important it was to embrace it fully. Mike had come to realize that true wealth wasn't measured by how much money you had or the accolades you collected. It was in the relationships you nurtured, the lives you touched, and the difference you made in the world. His life, once centered on fame, fortune, and fleeting pleasures, now revolved around Emma's health and the legacy he could leave behind for others in need. One afternoon, Mike sat beside Emma's hospital bed, reading a book to her. It had become a routine of sorts, her asking him to read her favorite stories from his childhood, and him gladly indulging her request. As he turned the page of a worn-out novel, he noticed how much lighter Emma seemed. She no longer wore the mask of fear and uncertainty that had once dominated her face. Instead, there was a peace in her expression that filled the room with warmth. "Mike," she said softly, interrupting his reading, "I think I've decided something." Mike looked up, meeting her gaze with a reassuring smile. "What's that?" Emma hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I want to go back to school. I want to finish what I started. I know I've been through so much, but I feel like I owe it to myself to keep going." Mike's heart swelled with pride. It wasn't just the words she said, it was the determination behind them. This was a young woman who had faced unimaginable hardships, yet still found the courage to dream. "That's incredible, Emma," Mike said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "You can do anything you set your mind to. I believe in you." For the first time in a long while, Emma's eyes glistened with tears. But they were not tears of pain or sadness. They were tears of hope. Hope that, despite everything she had been through, there was still a future for her. A future full of possibilities, dreams, and new beginnings. It was in that moment that Mike realized something profound. While Emma's recovery was still a long road, she had already made the most important step. She had chosen to live. She had chosen to fight, not just for her health, but for her future. And as her friend, her supporter, and the man who had vowed to help her, Mike made a silent promise. He would stand by her as she pursued her dreams, as she re-entered the world with a renewed spirit, and as she built a life beyond the hospital walls. In the weeks that followed, Mike continued to honor his commitment to Emma's care. But his efforts didn't stop there. He started working on the foundation he had created, Hope's Horizon, ensuring that more children like Emma would receive the care and support they needed. His focus was no longer solely on Emma's recovery, it was on creating lasting change in the world. He knew that he couldn't save everyone, but he could give as many children as possible the chance to survive, to thrive, and to pursue their own dreams. One of the first projects of the foundation was to provide scholarships for children who had faced life-threatening illnesses, children who had the potential to change the world, but who had been held back by their circumstances. Emma, now well enough to leave the hospital, became a shining example of what could be accomplished with the right kind of support. Mike arranged for Emma to speak at the foundation's first event. She was nervous at first, but Mike was there, standing beside her as she took the stage. Her voice wavered slightly as she spoke about her journey, but it was clear from the way the audience responded that her story had touched their hearts. "I've been through a lot," Emma said, her voice trembling but steady, "but I'm here today because I made a choice. I chose to live. And now, I want to help others choose to live, too." The crowd erupted in applause. Mike looked on, overwhelmed with emotion. Emma was no longer just the young woman he had helped in her darkest hour. She was a beacon of hope for others, a living testament to the power of resilience, and an inspiration to anyone who had ever faced adversity. As the event concluded, Mike felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had helped Emma regain her health, but more importantly, he had helped her find her purpose again. And that was worth more than any award. More than any film project or red carpet event. In the days that followed, Emma moved back into her apartment, surrounded by friends and family who had supported her from the beginning. Mike visited often. But now their relationship had shifted from one of caretaker and patient to one of friendship and mutual respect. They had both been changed by their experiences, by the hospital walls. The endless treatments. The sleepless nights, but they had also both found something greater, a renewed faith in the power of love, of human connection, and of the possibility of second chances. The future was uncertain, but it was full of hope. For Emma, for Mike, and for all the children who would benefit from hope's horizon. Together, they had created something lasting. Something that would go beyond any single story, any single person. They had created a future of possibilities. As Emma's life settled into a new routine of health and purpose, Mike began to see the profound effect their journey had created. Hope's horizon was gaining momentum, attracting support from various sectors, healthcare professionals, philanthropists, and, most importantly, the community of people whose lives had been touched by Emma's story. What had started as a simple act of kindness, a man helping a sick girl, had blossomed into something far greater. Mike was no longer just an actor, he had become a symbol of compassion, action, and change. With each passing day, the Foundation's mission expanded. The focus was clear: to provide children facing life-threatening illnesses with the care, treatment, and emotional support they needed to not only survive but to thrive. The Foundation had become a beacon of hope, offering a chance at life to those who had previously been invisible in society's eyes. And Emma, once a young woman in a hospital bed, now stood at the forefront of this movement, advocating for a cause that had become her life's work. One of the key initiatives that Emma was most passionate about was the creation of a scholarship program for young patients who, like her, had been sidelined by illness. These scholarships would allow children to continue their education, receive necessary medical care, and pursue their dreams without the weight of financial burdens. Emma had always been a believer in the power of education, and now she was determined to give that opportunity to others. It was a cold winter afternoon when the first scholarship ceremony was held. The event took place in a small community center in the heart of the city. Mike was there, of course. But this time he wasn't the main focus. This time, it was Emma. She was the one who stood at the podium, surrounded by children and their families, sharing her story and speaking with a depth of gratitude that could only come from someone who had experienced true hardship. "I stand here today," Emma began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "not just as a survivor, but as a witness to the power of support. When I was sick, I didn't have the luxury of worrying about my future. But because of the kindness and generosity of people like you, I now have the chance to live, to dream, and to help others do the same." Her words resonated deeply with everyone in the room. Families who had been living in fear for their children's futures found solace in Emma's words. It was a reminder that no matter the obstacles one faced, there was always hope. Mike watched from the side of the room, his chest swelling with pride. This was what it was all about. This was the legacy he had always hoped to create, not through fame, but through love and compassion. As Emma finished her speech, a group of young scholarship recipients came forward to receive their awards. Each child had a story, stories of courage, of resilience, of dreams that had once seemed impossible. Some had fought cancer, others had battled rare diseases, and all of them had faced challenges far beyond their years. But here, in this room, they were given something that would change the course of their lives: hope. Mike couldn't help but reflect on the incredible impact of this moment. It wasn't just about the money or the treatments. It was about what those scholarships represented: the chance to reclaim a future, to continue the fight when it seemed like everything was against them. It was about the promise of new beginnings, and the idea that no one, no matter their circumstances, should ever be denied a chance at life. The ceremony ended with a sense of quiet triumph. Families embraced. Children laughed. And Mike could see the future unfolding before him. Emma, standing beside him, looked more at peace than he had ever seen her. She had come a long way from the sick young woman in the hospital bed. Now, she was not just surviving, she was thriving. And through Hope's Horizon, she was helping others do the same. But even as they celebrated their achievements, Emma knew that there was still more to be done. The foundation was growing. And with that growth came new challenges, new opportunities, and new lives to touch. The work was far from over. But Emma no longer saw it as a burden. She saw it as her purpose. And as long as there were children who needed help, she would continue to fight for them, just as Mike had fought for her. That night, as Mike and Emma walked home from the event, the streets were quiet, and the air crisp. Mike looked at Emma, his heart full of gratitude for everything they had accomplished together. "You've changed so many lives, Emma," Mike said quietly. "You've given them something more than just a second chance. You've given them a reason to believe." Emma smiled, the weight of everything they had been through evident in her eyes. "We've given each other that reason," she replied softly. "Together, we've created something that will last." And as they walked side by side, they knew that the journey was far from over. There would always be more work to do, more lives to touch, more hope to share. But for the first time, they both felt that the future was no longer uncertain. It was full of possibility, full of promise, and full of love. Their legacy had only just begun. The days following the scholarship ceremony were filled with a sense of renewed energy. Hope's Horizon was growing exponentially. And with every new donation, every new partnership, Emma felt that the foundation's reach was extending further than she had ever imagined. The momentum was undeniable. Yet, despite the outward success, there were moments when she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here, the painful past that had shaped her, and the people who had been with her every step of the way. Mike, too, was in a period of introspection. He had spent much of his life in the spotlight, navigating the world of fame and fortune. But it wasn't until he had met Emma that he truly understood the weight of purpose. The work they were doing together felt different, more meaningful, more lasting than any movie role or glamorous event he had ever been a part of. He had found a new calling in helping others, and it filled a part of him that fame and fortune never had. Emma had been the spark that ignited this new path for him, and he was determined to walk it with her. One afternoon, as the winter months began to fade, Emma sat down with Mike at their usual cafe, a small but cozy spot nestled in the heart of the city. The cafe had become a place where they could relax, away from the constant buzz of their public lives, and talk about the future. Emma was sipping on her coffee, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup thoughtfully. "Mike," she began, her voice serious yet filled with a quiet determination. "I've been thinking a lot about how we can scale Hope's Horizon. We've made so much progress, but there are so many more kids out there who need help. I want to do more, but I'm not sure where to start." Mike nodded, understanding the weight of her words. They had already achieved so much, but there was always that nagging feeling of wanting to do more, wanting to make an even bigger impact. The world was vast, and the problems they were tackling were just as wide-reaching. "We could partner with larger hospitals, expand our outreach programs, maybe even set up clinics for kids in underserved areas," Mike suggested, his mind racing with ideas. "But we need to think bigger, more than just local or national. What about creating a global network of care, a way for children across the world to connect with resources and treatments they might not otherwise have access to?" Emma's eyes lit up at the idea. A global network, that was the key. She had always felt that the reach of Hope's Horizon should go beyond borders, beyond the limitations of one city or country. The idea of creating a space where children from all walks of life could have access to the care they deserved, regardless of where they were born, felt like the next logical step. "I love that idea," Emma said, her voice filled with excitement. We can create a digital platform, a global hub where children, families, and medical professionals can connect. It would provide educational resources, funding options, and a community of support that spans the globe. Mike could see that the idea had sparked something inside Emma. He had never seen her so passionate about something before. This was more than just a plan, this was her vision for the future. And Mike knew that with her determination and the resources they had built through Hope's Horizon, it was possible. Over the next several weeks, Emma and Mike worked tirelessly to develop the blueprint for their new global initiative. They brought in experts from various fields, medical professionals, technologists, philanthropists, to help create a platform that would be both accessible and effective. It was a monumental task, but one that they felt was worth every ounce of effort. As the project began to take shape, they reached out to potential partners from all over the world. They spoke with healthcare providers in remote areas, spoke to families who had faced the challenges of accessing care, and listened to the voices of those who had always been overlooked. The need for this kind of platform was clear, and with each conversation, their vision became more refined. Finally, after months of planning, they were ready to launch the global network. The platform was named Global Reach, and it was designed to serve as an international resource for children facing severe illnesses. It was a lifeline, a place where families could find not only medical assistance but also emotional support, financial help, and the connection to others who understood their struggles. The launch event was held in a beautiful, open-air venue on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't extravagant, no red carpets or flashing cameras, just a gathering of those who had been a part of the journey. Mike stood beside Emma, his heart full of pride, as Emma spoke to the crowd about the mission of Global Reach. The words she spoke were filled with the same quiet strength and empathy that had defined her from the very beginning. "We have always believed," Emma said, her voice steady, "that no child should have to fight alone. With Global Reach, we can make sure that every child, no matter where they are in the world, has access to the care, support, and love they deserve." The crowd erupted into applause, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the world had stopped to acknowledge the significance of what they had accomplished. Mike stood beside Emma, taking in the sight of all the people who had come together to support this cause. He knew that this was just the beginning. There were many more battles to fight, but they had made a powerful first step. As the sun set that evening, Emma looked out over the crowd, her heart swelling with gratitude and determination. She knew that Global Reach would change the world, one life at a time, and with Mike by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next.